The grease popped and sang in the black iron skillets long before the sun gave up its light. It was that gold hour at the county fair, the kind that made even the dust look soft, made the plywood booths glow like something out of an old postcard. And the smell, that thick, honest smell of cornmeal and hot oil and fresh-caught fish, rolled out over the fairground in a way that pulled people off the midway and into a line that bent twice around the fry booth before it ever reached the counter. He stood back near the fence, away from the noise, hands resting on the worn top rail the way they always had. His jacket was the same one he wore every fall, patched at the elbow, softened by years of weather. He didn't wave. He didn't call attention, he watched. Behind the counter, the committee ladies moved in practiced rhythm, aprons dusted white with flour, tongs clacking against skillet edges, voices calling out orders like a small, cheerful machine. Their faces shone with sweat and effort, cheeks flushed from the heat of frying, satisfaction plain in the way they smiled at the long line still growing behind the rope. What none of the folks in that line fully understood, what only a few of them even remembered, was where the fish had come from that morning. Pulled silver and slick from cool water before daylight, cleaned on a wooden table by the barn, packed in ice in the bed of an old pickup, and driven those 2 miles down the county road before the fair gates even opened. From a pond that, not so long ago, folks had called an eyesore. A pond that had been nothing but cracked gray clay, split like old leather, holding nothing but dust and the memory of water. He thought of that now, watching the line shuffle forward, watching plates pile high with golden fillets that steamed in the cooling evening air. He thought of how strange it was that the very water people once wanted to pave over now filled bellies and put smiles on faces that had never once thanked him, never once looked twice at his patched jacket or his rusted truck. He didn't need them to know. That wasn't why he'd done it. A boy ran past holding a paper plate too heavy for his small hands, fish sliding dangerously close to the edge, laughing anyway. An old farmer he recognized from the feed store nodded at him once, maybe understanding more than the rest, then turned back to his plate. He pulled his cap down slightly against the low sun and let his eyes drift toward the folding tables set along the fence, the same tables the committee had once stood beside on his property, clipboards in hand, talking about drainage and parking and waste. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of fry oil past him one more time, and somewhere far off in his memory, another wind moved instead across a dry, splitting pond bed, one season before all of this began. That earlier season had begun long before any flood, long before the smell of fry oil or the sound of children laughing over paper plates. It began in the gray hours before dawn, when the farm was silent except for the creak of the porch step under his boots and the low call of mourning doves in the fence line. He rose early out of habit, the kind of habit that never left a man once it had been carved into him by years he rarely spoke of. Coffee first, black and bitter, drunk standing at the window while the sky turned from indigo to ash. Then the walk. It was the same walk every morning, down past the leaning tool shed, along the fence he kept meaning to replace, to the low stretch of land where the pond used to be. He called it a pond still, though by then it was little more than a wound in the earth, a wide basin of cracked clay, gray-brown and sun-baked, split into 1,000 jagged plates like the shell of something long dead. Weeds pushed up through some of the cracks, stubborn and thin, the only green in a place that had once held water deep enough for cattle to wade into on hot afternoons, decades back, when his wife was still alive and the farm still had hands enough to keep it whole. He would stand at the edge of it most mornings, hands in his jacket pockets, saying nothing, the way another man might stand before a grave. The clay held the shape of loss the way old wood holds the shape of nails long since pulled free. He knew every crack in that basin the way he knew the calluses on his own palms. He knew where the wind carried dust across it in the afternoons, knew where a killdeer liked to nest along the far bank, knew that after each summer the fissures deepened just a little more, mapping the slow erosion of something no one else in the county thought was worth saving. It would have been easy enough to let it be. Easier still, some said, to do what the ladies from church suggested when they came through with their clipboards that spring. Pave it, fill it, forget it, put it to some use a man could point to and call practical. He had listened to them that afternoon without much expression, the way he listened to most things people said about his land, his truck, his jacket with the frayed cuffs. He hadn't argued. He rarely did. But walking that basin each morning, watching the light catch the pale, cracked clay like the skin of something waiting to be given back its breath, he had already begun turning something over in his mind, something none of them would have guessed, something built less on hope than on a stubborn, quiet faith that the land still remembered how to hold water, if only someone was patient enough to teach it again. They had come on a Tuesday, the kind of pale April morning when the frost hadn't quite let go of the fence posts, 4 of them stepping careful across the yard in their good shoes, clipboard passing hand to hand like something ceremonial. He'd watched them from the porch before he went down to meet them, the way he might have once watched movement at a tree line, sizing up the shape of a thing before it announced itself. The head of the committee was a tall woman with a voice made for hymn announcements, and she led them straight past the barn, past the sagging fence he'd been meaning to mend, down toward the basin without asking if she ought to. She stood at the lip of it a long moment. Below her the clay stretched out gray-white and cracked in long, crooked seams, dropping away into a shallow bowl of nothing, a few brittle weeds pushing up through the fissures like something trying to remember what it used to be. One of the younger women laughed, not unkindly, just surprised, the way people laugh at a joke they don't expect to be standing in the middle of. "Lord, it's a hazard," the tall woman said, more to the clipboard than to him. "A child could break an ankle down in there, or worse." He said nothing. He rarely did when people told him what his land was. They talked among themselves the way people do when they've already decided something and are only working out the kindest words to wrap it in. Someone mentioned the fair committee needed more parking for the harvest social. Someone else said gravel would do it, maybe crushed limestone. Wouldn't take much to level a thing already flat as a griddle. The tall woman nodded along, tapping her pen against the clipboard like a woodpecker finding rhythm, and then she turned to him with the particular gentleness people use when they think they're doing you a favor. "You ought to think about filling this in," she said. "It's just sitting here doing nothing. Might as well make it useful." He looked down into the cracked bowl of it, at the pale seams running like old scars across the clay, at the killdeer picking its way along the far bank where it always had, spring after spring, whether anyone noticed or not. He thought of the water that had once stood there before the drought years took it, thought of the way clay could hold a memory of rain long after the rain itself was gone, if a man was patient and didn't rush the mending. "Might," he said, which was the only thing he said the whole visit, and it was enough to make 2 of them exchange a look, the kind that said they'd expected something more, an argument maybe, or at least an excuse. He walked them back up to their car without another word, tipped his cap the way his mother had taught him, and stood in the yard a long while after they'd gone, looking down at the basin the way a man looks at an old wound he intends, quietly and without any announcement at all, to heal. That night, after the dishes were washed and set to dry, after the porch light had drawn its usual moths and been switched off again, He took the flashlight from the drawer where it had lived since before his wife passed and walked back down to the pond in the dark. The beam moved slow across the cracked floor of it, catching the pale dust that had settled into every seam, throwing long shadows where the clay had curled up at the edges, like old paper left too long in the sun. He crouched at the near bank the way he used to crouch checking a perimeter, weight low, eyes patient, not looking for what was easy to see but for what was hiding underneath the obvious. A man could look at a dry pond and see only absence. He had learned, a long time ago and in places he didn't speak of, that absence was rarely the whole truth. Something was always still there, waiting on whoever was willing to look twice. He walked the bank slow, flashlight low, the way he'd once walked a line at first light, checking for what needed tending before the day claimed it. The killdeer had gone quiet somewhere in the dark, but he knew it was there, same as it had been that afternoon, same as it would be tomorrow, because some things came back to a place whether or not the place looked worth coming back to. He knelt at the deepest part of the bowl, where the cracks ran widest, and pressed his palm flat against the clay. It was cool, and beneath the cool there was a kind of give, a memory of moisture that hadn't fully left it, not after all these dry years. Clay held water the way old wounds held weather. You could tell a storm was coming before the sky admitted it. He had seen enough of both, water and wounds, to trust that instinct over any woman's clipboard opinion made in an afternoon's polite passing. He did not decide right then to haul wire or set barrels. That would come later, in pieces, the way most honest work does. What he decided, kneeling there with the flashlight throwing his shadow long and crooked across the broken clay, was simpler than that, and older, some rule set into him before he'd ever farmed a day in his life. You did not leave behind what still might be saved, not a man, not a field, not a pond a woman had looked at and called worthless because it wasn't doing anything for anybody that afternoon. He switched off the flashlight and sat a while in the dark, listening to the frogs that hadn't yet returned but would, listening to the wind moving over ground that would hold water again if he was patient and did not rush the mending. Then he rose, knees complaining the way they always did, and walked back up toward the house, already turning over, in the quiet arithmetic of a man who'd rebuilt harder things than this, what the first morning's work would need to be. The first morning he began, frost still lay silver in the low places of the yard, and his breath went ahead of him in small clouds toward the barn where the wire was stacked. Years of fence mending had left him with coils nobody else wanted, rusted hog wire pulled off collapsing pasture lines, barbed strands too kinked for a proper fence, cattle panels bent from some forgotten storm. He had saved all of it the way he saved everything, on the theory that a thing not yet ruined all the way through still had a use waiting on it. Now he saw what that use was. He worked before the sun cleared the tree line, while the ground still held its night cool and his knees allowed him the most before the ache set in. He carried the wire down in armloads, looping it over his shoulder, the way he might once have carried something heavier, and at the pond's broken rim he began to shape it, bending panels into shallow arcs, driving in the old fence posts he'd pulled from a collapsed line behind the machine shed, lacing wire between them low against the crumbling bank. It was not fast work. Clay does not forgive a hurried hand, and where the bank had slumped into the dry bed, he had to cut back the loose earth first, packing what remained firm before he ever strung a strand across it. He talked to no one about it. When his neighbor's boy drove past on the county road and slowed to look, he only lifted a hand and kept working, the way a man does when the work itself is the whole of what he has to say. By mid-morning, the sun found him bent over the same 8 feet of bank he'd started on, testing wire, tamping clay, standing back to sight along the line the way he'd once sighted along a fence he could not afford to build wrong. He moved slow, he moved sure. Each morning added another few feet of shaped bank to what had been only crumbling edge the week before, and each evening he stood at the fence line studying the shape of what he'd made, the way the wire held the loose clay's memory of a bank instead of letting it slide further into the cracked bowl below. It was work with no visible reward yet. No water, no green edge, nothing but reinforced dirt holding a shape that meant nothing to a passerby's eye. He knew that. He had done work like it before, in places where the payoff was measured in years instead of afternoons, and he had learned not to need the proof before he trusted the labor. So he kept at it in the cool hours, wire in his gloved hands, clay under his boots, the frogs still silent in the ditches beyond, waiting on rain that hadn't yet come, and a season that hadn't yet turned toward what he was already, quietly, building it to hold. The wire held. That much he'd proven to himself, and now the work turned to what the water itself would need once it came. Not just a bowl to sit in, but a place with bones in it, places for shadow and shelter, places a fish too young to know danger, yet could hide from a heron's eye or a summer sun that would otherwise cook the shallows dead. He started hauling brush from the tree line behind the barn, deadfall he'd let sit for 2 winters, because a man never knows when broken branches might still be worth something. He dragged it down to the basin in armloads, then later in the truck bed when his knees told him plainly that armloads were a young man's arithmetic. He piled it low against the eastern bank where the sun would hit hardest come July, angled the heavier logs so they'd sit half-buried once the clay softened around them, building the kind of tangled cover a catfish would want long before he had a single catfish to want it. A man from the feed store saw him unloading a truck bed of rotted wood into a dry hole and didn't even bother hiding his laugh, said something about how, at least it'd make good kindling when the fool gave up. He didn't answer. He'd learned that a man arguing about a fire he hasn't lit yet is just wasting breath, better spent stacking wood. The barrels came next, one at a time, some bought for a few dollars at a farm sale, others rescued from behind the co-op where they'd sat rusting under a gutter no one bothered fixing. He set them at both ends of the machine shed roof, ran cut lengths of downspout and old garden hose between them, angled everything toward the basin with the same patience he'd once used sighting a rifle. Not fast, not dramatic, just true. The idea wasn't to flood the clay all at once. A hard rush of water on cracked ground would only carve new channels, undo the shaping he'd spent weeks getting right. What the bed wanted was a slow bleed, a patient soaking that would let the clay swell and knit itself back together, the way a wound closes better when it isn't rushed. So he built the barrels to trickle, not pour, fitted with valves scavenged from an irrigation pile he'd kept behind the barn since before his wife passed, back when he still thought he'd need them for something else. He tested the system dry first, walking the length of hose to check for a place where gravity might cheat him, then stood back and looked at what he'd made: wire-bound banks, brush sunk low for shelter, a scatter of barrels waiting on a roof line for the first real rain of the season. It looked like nothing to anyone driving past. It looked, to him, like a door left open, waiting only for the sky to decide it was time to walk through it. The talk started small, the way it always did in that town, passed between men who had nothing but time and coffee going cold in front of them. Someone had driven past his place on the county road and seen the barrels lined up on the rise above the pond bed, the wire glinting where it caught the morning sun, and by the time the story reached the diner, it had already grown a little, the way stories do when they pass through enough hands. "Rigging up rain barrels for a mud hole," one of them said, grinning around his cup. Man's got more time than sense. They laughed easy, the kind of laugh that didn't need much fuel, just an old man and a strange notion to catch fire on. Someone mentioned the wire he'd hauled in from who knew where, rusted fence stuff nobody else would have bothered picking up off a scrap pile, and another added that he'd heard the man was down there some mornings before sunrise, walking the banks like he was inspecting a perimeter, like there was something worth guarding in all that cracked gray clay. "Old habits," the first one said, tapping his temple. "Some men can't let go of standing watch over nothing." It wasn't cruel, not exactly, more the careless kind of mockery that men trade over eggs and toast when they've got a slow morning and someone else's business to chew on. But it found its way to him anyway, the way small-town talk always does, carried by a neighbor who meant well, or a feed store clerk who mentioned it without thinking, letting it drop that folks in town were calling it his new hobby, like a man his age ought to be done with hobbies, ought to be sitting still. He didn't answer when it reached him, didn't drive into town to set anyone straight, didn't so much as raise the subject with the neighbor who'd passed it along, looking apologetic before he'd even finished saying it. He only nodded, the way he might have acknowledged weather he couldn't change, and went back to checking the valve fittings, back to walking the wire-bound bank to see if the brush piles had settled the way he wanted. There was a discipline in it that no one at that counter would have recognized, the kind that didn't need an audience to keep it standing straight. He'd learned long ago that explaining yourself to men who'd already decided what they thought was a waste of breath, better spent elsewhere, on tightening a valve, on checking a hose line, on watching the sky for the color it turned before a real rain came. So the pond kept its barrels, and the barrels kept their patient drip, and the talk kept circling the diner like smoke that never quite cleared the room, and he kept working, quiet as ever, while above the valley the clouds that mattered were still a long way off, gathering themselves slowly, the way everything worth trusting seemed to. The weeks that followed had no drama in them, only the plain arithmetic of showing up. Every morning before the frost had fully lifted off the grass, he walked the perimeter of the pond bed with a coffee can of wet clay slung by a wire handle, kneeling where the cracks had opened widest overnight, working the mud into them with his thumbs the way a man might press a bandage into a wound that kept wanting to reopen. The clay was cold, and it stained the creases of his knuckles a color that never quite washed out, and he didn't mind that either. He had a system, though he'd never have called it that out loud. Start at the northeast corner, where the sun hit first, work clockwise, check the barrels last, because that was where the day's judgment would be handed down, in inches of water gained or lost. The barrels themselves had become a kind of congregation, lined along the fence he'd strung, each one catching whatever the sky offered and doling it out through the drip lines he'd fashioned from old irrigation hose, punched with holes no bigger than a nail. He checked the levels twice a day, marking them in pencil on a board nailed to the fence post, numbers climbing so slowly that a stranger glancing at the board might have thought nothing was happening at all. But he could read those numbers the way another man might read a ledger, and he knew the difference between a bed that was merely damp and a bed that was beginning, in its stubborn clay way, to remember what it was for. At night he kept the radio on low, tuned to the farm report out of the county seat, listening past the grain prices for the weathermen who spoke in fronts and pressure systems, in words like developing and watch, words that meant something different to him now than they once had. He'd sit at the kitchen table with a cup going cold and a pencil behind his ear, and when the forecaster mentioned a chance of rain moving up from the south, he'd go quiet in a way that had nothing to do with doubt. It was on an afternoon no different from the others, gray and close, that he walked the bank and found, in the low center of the pond, a skin of water no thicker than a coin, trembling faintly where the wind touched it. He crouched there a long while, not saying anything, just watching the way light moved across it, thin and uncertain, like something learning to hold itself together. He didn't call anyone to see it. He simply reached down, touched the surface with 2 fingers, and let the cold of it settle into him. The first real proof, however small, that the ground had not forgotten how to keep a promise. The rain that came a week later did not announce itself the way the radio men had promised. It came sideways, first, then straight down, then sideways again, as if the sky itself couldn't decide how much punishment it meant to deliver. He stood on the porch in his old jacket, watching the tree line disappear into gray, and he did not go inside. He had waited too long for water to hide from it now. By midnight, the county's creeks had left their banks. He heard it on the radio the next morning, the announcer's voice tight and fast, reading off names of roads that were under water, of low fields turned to lakes overnight. Down at the Hendricks place, the bottom 40 was gone under 3 feet of brown water, corn stalks bent flat like they'd been pressed by a great hand. The millers lost fence line clean for half a mile, posts and wire dragged into a ditch a quarter mile from where they'd stood. Trucks sat stalled on the county road, headlights glowing dull under the flood like something drowned. He walked out to the pond before the sun was fully up, boots sinking into mud that used to be dust, and stopped at the edge of what he'd built. The brush piles had shifted but held, tangled and dark, doing exactly what he'd asked of them, breaking the water's rush, softening its temper before it reached the bank. The old fence wire, rusted and ugly, had done what wire does best. It had held. The clay, packed tight over a season of patient hauling and careful water, had swollen and sealed itself against the surge instead of splitting beneath it. The pond was full. Not just full, brimming, dark and heavy, lapping gently at the reinforced edge like it had always belonged there, like it had never been a cracked, dry wound in the land at all. He stood there a long time, rain still falling soft now, and said nothing to the empty field around him. There was no one to say it to. That was the strange shape of vindication out here. No audience, no ledger, just the pond itself, holding steady while everything around it had come apart. Word came slow through the wet roads that others were begging trucks and sandbags to save what they could. He didn't go into town that day. He walked the bank instead, checking the wire, touching the brush piles, watching the water settle into itself, dark and full, and finally still, as if it too understood what it meant to be trusted with something worth keeping. The auction notice had come pinned to the feed store bulletin board weeks before the flood, easy to miss among the seed prices and the church bake sale flyers. A hatchery 2 counties over, gone under, its tanks and stock and equipment to be sold off in a single Saturday sale. He'd read it twice at the time and folded it into his jacket pocket without much thought, the way a man tucks away a fact that might matter later. Now, with the water sitting full and dark behind him, it mattered. He drove out early, the truck rattling over roads still soft from the storm, past ditches running high, and fields other men were still fighting to drain. The hatchery yard was quiet when he arrived, tanks drained down to puddles, a handful of buyers kicking at empty crates, looking for anything worth hauling home. Nobody wanted the fingerlings. They were small, unremarkable, crowded into a single holding tank nobody had bothered to advertise. The auctioneer practically gave them away, glad to have one less thing to load onto the truck bound for the scrap sale. He bought the whole tank. Paid in cash, folded bills counted out slow and careful, the kind of money that had been saved rather than spent. The auctioneer barely looked up. A neighbor loading fence posts nearby watched him haul the tank onto his truck bed and shook his head the way men do when they've already decided a thing is foolish and don't need new evidence to confirm it. He didn't argue. He never did. He drove the fingerlings home slow, careful not to slosh the water too hard, the truck bed rocking gentle, with a cargo most of the county wouldn't have looked at twice. At the pond, he waded in past his knees, the clay firm beneath his boots now, holding the way it was built to hold, and released them handful by handful into water that had, weeks before, been nothing but a dry, cracked wound in the land. They scattered into the dark, like something returning to a place they'd always belonged, and he stood there watching the ripples fade until the surface went still again. Back in town, the story moved the way stories do. A shrug at the diner counter, a raised eyebrow at the feed store, someone saying he'd gone and spent good money on fish nobody could even see yet, for a pond nobody thought would hold. He heard it second-hand, the way he heard most things now, and said nothing back. He had learned, a long time ago, that some answers took a season to arrive, and he was willing, as always, to wait for his. The season turned the way seasons do when a man isn't watching the calendar so much as the water. Spring rains came and went, softer now, easier on land that had already learned to hold what fell on it. The brush piles he'd sunk along the banks grew slick with algae, and small things came to live in the shade of them, minnows first, then frogs, then the deep hush of something larger moving beneath the surface on quiet evenings. He'd walk down at dusk most days, not to work, just to look, the way another man might check on a grave or a garden. The clay had held through winter, it had held through the spring melt. By the time the cottonwoods along the fence line went full and heavy with leaf, the pond had stopped looking like something he'd built and started looking like something that had simply always been there. The fish grew the way fish grow when nobody's rushing them, slow, then all at once. By midsummer they were fat, dark-backed, moving in schools he could see from the bank if the light hit right, and word of that kind of thing doesn't stay quiet in a county that small. Boys walked out from town just to see it. A man from 2 farms over asked if he could bring his grandson down to fish it, and he said yes, the way he said yes to most things that cost him nothing but time. The pond became something people mentioned the way they mentioned weather, a fact of the place now, no longer a joke passed around a diner counter. It was the week before the fair when the trouble found him, though it wasn't his trouble to start. The regular supplier, some outfit 2 counties over, that had promised the fry booth its catfish for going on 6 years running, called the fair committee with bad news, a failed pond of their own, some sickness in the water, an order they couldn't fill. The fair was 3 days off. The booth was already advertised on the church bulletin board and the feed store window both, fresh catfish fry, same as every year, and now there was nothing behind the promise but an empty tank and a phone call nobody wanted to make twice. Somebody at the fair committee, not the church ladies, not yet, just a tired man trying to solve a problem before it became everyone's problem, started asking around the county for anyone with fish to sell on short notice. And it didn't take long, not in a place where everybody knew everybody's business, before someone mentioned the old dried-up pond that wasn't dried up anymore. He didn't say much when they came asking. He never did. He walked them down to the water, showed them the nets, the holding pen he'd built from the same old fence wire that once looked like a fool's fencing around a mud hole, and told them to bring their tanks whenever they were ready. 3 days later, the fair had its catfish, pulled fresh from a pond that had been called an eyesore not 2 summers back, and nobody at the booth thought to ask where the fish had come from before, because the frying was good and the line was long, and that was all that mattered to a hungry crowd. The booth couldn't hold the numbers. Word travels faster than a fair schedule, and by Saturday afternoon there were more folks wanting fried catfish than the little fairground stand could seat or serve, and somebody, he never did find out who first said it, suggested the fry move out to where the fish had come from, out to his farm, by the water, where there was shade and room and the pond, right there to prove the thing wasn't a trick. So that was where it ended up, tables set along the bank under the brush piles he'd once piled for shade and structure, women from the committee frying in cast iron over propane burners, plates passed hand to hand down a line that stretched back toward the barn. He stood by the fence in his old jacket, same as always, not saying much, watching the same women who once stood on that clay bed, calling it useless, now standing beside it, feeding half the county. It was near evening when she found him there, apron still on, hands still smelling of oil and cornmeal. She didn't make a speech. She set a plate in his hands first, before her own, before anyone's, and she said only that she'd been wrong, that she should have looked twice at what looked useless before she opened her mouth about it. He didn't need more than that. He nodded, the way he nodded at most things, and took a bite of catfish that had grown up in water he'd hauled wire and brush and barrels to save, and he said it was good, and that was true. The fry stayed on his farm after that. Year after year, the committee's fundraiser moved permanent to the bank of a pond that had once been cracked clay and a joke at a diner counter. Nobody suggested paving it for parking again. It sat there full and quiet, doing what it had always been meant to do, and he let the water speak for him, same as it always had.